Hi, this is Carson Badger with Badger Sports Management Group, and I'm here with episode 2 of our N.I.L historical breakdown. Probably should come up with the title of the series at some point. Nevertheless, excited to drop back in for the week. This is the last week of May, and so our formatting in terms of kind of how we're approaching it, we're going to go through some kind of two big news articles and then pick up from where we left off. We really saw the rise of, really the formation of college sports. And now I'm excited to pick up from that thread in terms of really what this episode is about is the rise of the administrative state. How these, formations in the NCAA in particular really came into power. As well as I'm excited to talk about kind of one of the first cases that I think will really be applicable towards our modern times and hopefully uncovering the story of where NIL came from. At least to start, the first two news articles that I'm kind of excited about and keyed in on. Always begin there. So the first story I saw was about a push among, in particular, the SEC, but certain college football programs to push for a salary cap. Nick Saban is kind of championing this in terms of having a budget. Each program, each university has a set amount of funds, and they will be able to redistribute those to their players for their NIL purposes. It's an interesting argument. It's an interesting development. It's not surprising that it's come out of place. Right now we have an unregulated market. So there is no rules and regulations really about that. I'll touch on that for the second news article, but within this kind of push for a salary cap type motive, the most obvious thing that for me, on kind of the legal side, and we'll talk about this on the business of the development side as well, is that it's awkward. There's a gap. There's a fundamental misunderstanding. And we've seen this throughout the history of the NCAA approaching it of the sport looks like one thing, and yet we're calling it something else. So student athlete, that concept, student athlete, that abbreviation, it turns out was intentional. But what you're not doing is you're not calling them athletes. You're not calling them, when you think of athletes, you go to the pro leagues, you're thinking about professionals, employees, employment contracts. All that is, it looks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. There's kind of this really basic analysis. And where I'm going with this in terms of this idea of a salary cap is salary caps are for collectively bargained agreements, CBAs. Those are what you see in every professional league is a CBA. But at the core, you have on one side is a employee union. So the athlete association, the players association, and they collectively bargain on behalf of all the athletes for the right of the collective with the other entity, which is the ownership in the kind of professional leagues. But in this case, by putting in a salary cap type model, you're collectively bargaining, or you're trying to get into a rules or regulations about how people are paid and how the owners pay those players or employees. Again, just broadly, not even athletics. We think about, contractor laborers. You're thinking about railroad unions. I mean, there's a lot of formational pieces that really go at this core idea of how a group of individuals who have a certain set of skills are compensated for. And every single time you go through that analysis, it's an employee-employer relationship. But that's not what this is in college sports right now. These are name, image, and likeness deals. These are, payments for the rights of their image, but it's not employee protection. It's very clear that this is not an employer conversation right now. It looks like it, but it's not being treated from both the ownership side, the court side. And because of that, this idea of salary caps, you're ultimately getting into conversation of price fixing, fixing the goods of the economy. How much is a player's appearance worth? Oh, well, you can only spend so much money on this collective group. Well, again, that looks like a duck, quacks like a duck. That probably is a players' union, but they're trying to thread this needle of having everything look not like, it looks like an employment agreement, but they're not calling it, Because all of a sudden, once you open that, it's really Pandora's box for the college sports world. Is the moment you start paying these athletes as employees, you start recognizing employee rights, you get into issues like disability, medical leave, insurance qualifications, everything that we see in the business world, all of a sudden would apply. Now, I'm not trying to distance against it. If anything, that seems like the most natural course of where this thing will evolve, but it's not where it is in its infancy. Throughout this series and throughout my understanding, I'll talk about this. We really are in the gold rush era. Gold is just discovered in the NIL world. How it's regulated, right? Those minors, how their rights are being interpreted, we're in very early Western, early 1800s, mid 1800s law. This thing will take a while to evolve. I think in natural course, it makes sense that it will evolve into that space, but it's not where it is right now. So that collective bargaining agreement salary cap conversation was a pin in my needle. The second one I'm really watching is this goes into this, is the behind the scenes, is Ted Cruz and the Senate committee presented and I'm going to get this right, the Protect College Sports Acts of 2026 this week. And this has been an ongoing conversation. It is really the first piece of legislation that puts in place, not through the NCAA, which has been stripped down of its powers, but the NCAA, as a vehicle through congressional action, has rules, stipulations on how much payment is, what types of protections they have, what the contracts are going to look like. There really are kind of media rights. There's an entire bundle, and I will probably want to break this down more. I'm just kind of teeing this up as a conversation, but that is the second part of this, right? Not second, but, the obvious answer to any kind of solutions in this space is one of the branches that we're going to be looking at is the courts. Now, in order for when you're typically dealing with a legal case, you're 2 to 3 years past the initial dispute. So even Allstate v. NCAA, these are 10 years later. We'll talk about a case today. It took 2 to 3 years for this case to be heard by even the appellate court. So the issue within law is that it is a 2 to 3 year cycle before you're even in front of a judge. And when we think about using the court or the judicial route to solve our problems within NIL space and college sports, like that employee issue, it's going to take years for that to be a vehicle. So the other alternative is congressional action. How can Congress set across a federal law that details all the rules and regulations for how this industry is going to be regulated, industry being college sports. So I wanted to at least highlight that, as if there's more traction there, I would like to break down kind of nuances or things that I'm thinking about within that act. But just talking about vehicles for solving problems, right? Courts is in a route, congressional action or state regulation, state laws is another route to be able to potentially solve these issues. So two topics, fun, interesting, and definitely ones that will continue to be worth monitoring over the course as the time goes. Now, for today's actual substance course, let me get my notes up. We are picking up from where we left off in terms of the Carnegie Report. Now, as a reminder, the Carnegie Report is this really first expose into college sports. The college sports industry had been around for about 60 years. It had been operating in this really pay-to-play conversation. Professional sports leagues weren't really around. MLB was the first one to really pop up, but the idea of the NFL or the NBA, not a thing at all. So football is your kind of, baseball wasn't as popular, but football was really starting to show the traction as a, sport that people enjoyed. But you had, as we talked about with our Yale offensive linemen, we had 27-year-olds playing in college sports leagues. And so it was operating in that space. And this Carnegie Report, I have to kind of look at who actually paid for it, because I do think it's an interesting thing in terms of who was paying for this study. But it's the first expose. We get financial statements, we get audits, we get understandings of P&L statements. And within it, you have recommendations. As I noted kind of in my studies, that was like the first real conversation around this idea of amateurism, that these were not professional athletes, and that even the discussion of carving out the difference between athlete and student began in that Carnegie Report. But what that did within the sports industry is that it opened up eyes. people began to understand, okay, how's this business going to run? Now, at the same time, there's also a shift in American history. And I'm going to take a step back here to talk about some of the different movements that are going on. In particular, your juxtaposed between World War I and World War II. During World War II, you had the GI Bill. So you had a massive influx of veterans who were going back to college after serving in World War II. Now, in between that time, you're having the rise of really two things that I think are important for this industry and for this space. And that is you have the rise of labor unions, and second, you have the rise of the administrative state within broadly American society and American government. So within labor unions, you had the Fair Labor Bureaus Association Act. I don't want to misspeak here. You also have the National Labor Relations Act. And these are essential Fair Labor Standards Act and just got to zoom in a little bit on my notes. And National Labor Relations Act. These are 1935, 1938. These are linchpins of employees' right to strike, right to collectively bargain, setting federal minimum wages. And I guise this in terms of within American culture as the Industrial Revolution moves into this production state, really fueling the American economy, is you have the rise of employee rights. And so there is more litigation, there's more understanding about people's abilities to have these rights. Now, student athletes were not part of that conversation. There was no understanding that these were actual employees. But there is this rise of that interest within American culture broadly. And I think that lays like an underlying tone for then how the NCAA wanted to hand their students when it came out to the Sanity Code. And that's really going to be our conversation for today is on that. But the second, within this space, in terms of really key in between World War I and World War II, is you're having the rise of the administrative state. After FDR's New Deal, which created a vast majority of administrative kind of associations, you're really having this boom of the federal government. And I'll be able to kind of riff off in terms of, I lost my thoughts. I was talking about the New Deal and it feels something so intuitive that all people should be able to talk about. But FDR's New Deal, 1933 through 1940, in terms of when FDR was before World War II, stepping into his power. And what he was kind of creating is the SEC, the National Labor Relations Board Act, Social Security Administration, large government-run entities. This idea within American culture, and FDR really was the champion of this in a lot of ways, is big government. And the role of this higher federal level administrative state that can dictate rules downstream towards different states, towards different bureaus, different associations. And the reason why this is important for us is the NCAA began to take on a similar role. And I think this is where, kind of that dual track of understanding American history and American culture, its business, its laws, its regulation, and then viewing college sports as a subset of that is so important to how we approach these things, because it really understands how these issues are developing and where we're at right now. I mentioned today we have federal government talking about congressional action and how it wants to regulate college sports. That's a mirroring of how Congress is acting right now in general. Not even talking about the actual political nature of it. It's just they're mirroring exercises. So within this, you have the rise of labor unions, employee rights. You have the rise of the administrative state. It creates this environment where all of a sudden the NCAA realizes they can step in. They can step in and regulate and be able to administer their institutional groups. And that creates the Sanity Code. So this was regulation that came out and rules that came out in 1945 through 1948. And what we're looking at here within the Sanity Code, Sanity, is the first action of the NCAA to regulate. As I talked about with the GI Bill, there was a massive influx of college students and college athletics. Professional leagues were starting to form too. So I think as a whole, American interest in sports was growing. The business of sport was definitely blossoming. And so within that, college sports naturally was too. And what we see with the Sanity Code is its rules. It's the first real evidence of the NCAA actually trying to flex its powers. It's born out of the Carnegie Report about, what are the ways to enforce rules. Now, the Sanity Code is a well-known nature because it lays out rules for expulsion. If athletes are receiving scholarships that are not tied towards academics, then, and that's proxy for recruitment, right? Incentivizing people for something besides academics, which is normally how scholarships were working up for the first 100 years of American universities. So if any student was getting a scholarship related to athletics, related to expenditures, related to extra benefits, that would be a violation of the Sanity Code's rules. And so within a year, 2 years of the Sanity Code, immediately universities were getting flagged. It was a self-reporting process. It was a loose, they didn't really have employees that were going into this process of analyzing these things. And so it's this kind of free-for-all. We put in these rules, but then how is the enforcement actually going to happen? And there was a gap. And within the Sanity Code, this all came to a hold with what they called the 7 sinners. So this was 7 universities, mostly in the Atlantic area of Virginia, University of Virginia, Virginia Tech, Maryland, the Citadel, among a couple others, that got flagged. They got pinched for breaking the Sanity Code's regulations, essentially trying to give endorsements or scholarships. Now, it's not surprising. These were all mid-Atlantic universities. And so it was schools that were, Boston College was also included. These were all universities that were just recruiting the same players and then alleging their rivals probably stealing recruits. They were saying, hey, they're in violation of the Sanity Code. And so there was a hearing in New York City in 1950. And during this hearing, it came to a fold. What are we going to do with these universities, these 7 sinners, for expulsion purposes? And the only punishment laid out in the Sanity Code was to remove them from the NCAA. Now, this was a very harsh penalty at the time. And within it, there was this interesting story about University of North Carolina and North Carolina State both getting pinched for recruiting violations. Same thing in 1951. And what ended up happening is more or less North Carolina and North Carolina State more or less gave the NCAA the middle finger and said, we're not going to abide by these rules. And so in back-to-back years, you had this 7 sinners and then North Carolina State, 2 taking different approaches. The 7 sinners were sitting in a committee meeting and hearing out their infractions. And then the next year, North Carolina State said, no, we're actually not going to abide you. We don't really recognize you as a governing body, and we don't really agree to your rules. And what ends up happening is when they go to this expulsion vote is almost a 2-to-1 outlay, in which the universities recognize there's a gap. We can't really just be choosing to kick out these fundamental programs. You have to have a scale in terms of punishment. You have to have enforcement. And with North Carolina, which premier basketball program at the time, kind of getting up and going in the 1950s, apologies, with those coming in saying, no, we don't really recognize you, there was this facade. We have this thing called the NCAA. They came out with these rules in 1948, the Sanity Code, but no one was following them. There was no credibility here. And it created this conversation of what actually is the effect? What actually is the intent? And there was a gap. There was absolutely a gap. So in effect, they ruled to not kick out the 7 sinners, and they scrapped the Sanity Code. Within 5 years, it was already abandoned, and they went to rewrite the rules. And when they went to rewrite it, they recognized the game had shifted. You can't just have scholarships for academics. And so what ended up happening is you then have the creation within this space is the idea of a grant and aid. So kind of get there, but before I leave the Sanity Code, I think there was a couple other observations that I kind of put together in this space. One, the ability to threaten big time programs. When North Carolina said no, and the NCAA didn't have any recourses, there was this gap of when the premier blue chip programs are up for debate, when they're in violation of the rules, what effect actually can happen. And that wasn't much. And that's important for when we talk about SMU, when we talk about Penn State, when we talk about universities that are in violation of N.I.L rules, as we kind of will see in the upcoming year or two. So what? So I broke your rules. What are you going to do about it? And if you're in Alabama, if you're at Texas, are you really going to kick out Ohio State from college football? No. We saw it with University of Michigan. They had a litany of cheating scandals, and yet they're still playing football. They're still part of the Big Ten. You know, they kicked Jim Harbaugh out when he's already taken a new job to go to the NFL. They don't care. So this governing effectiveness of the NCAA, like even in the Sanity Code example, we see that it's this administrative state, but the groups, the states, the people actually with the power are saying, no, we actually don't really recognize you. So nugget there. And the second, and this just has to be said, is during these whole conversations, the Sanity Codes, the hearings, there's no athletes. There is little to no coaches involved. It tends to be faculty members of these universities, presidents, maybe the occasional athletic director, chancellors, volunteers. In effect, you have a gap between the haves and the have-nots, and the people actually in the space, the have-nots, the athletes, the coaches, the people at the core of the product are not being represented by the people making the rules. And I think that just has to be said in this space. We saw it previously, and we're going to continue to see this, of the people who are the product are not part of the conversation in terms of how this is being run. So call out there as a nugget to leave for later. So we reset. The Sanity Code, 1948, huge bust. What does the NCAA do? There's kind of two things that happen here. In 1952, we have the creation of grant and aid. And this is, kind of this conversation of you can have a scholarship and it's going to cover tuition and fees and room and board and books. So all of a sudden you're giving people these packages for the purposes of coming to your university, and are you going to be able to look at this? And immediately within the flagging of, is this an employee, pops up for the NCAA. This becomes a conversation about, again, disability insurance. If you're an employee and you get hurt during the course of your conduct and work, what happens? And this is where I kind of want to be able to talk about this establishment of the first executive director of the NCAA, Walter Briers. And he created this concept of, and he tethered it to the Carnegie Report, about the idea of a student athlete. He came out with a memoir in the 90s, and he was explicit. There was no denying this concept of a student athlete. He sought to bore out as a conversation about trying to peg this industry, not as employees, not as professional athletes, but as student athletes. And student creates this association of professional trade or amateurism. And Briers was explicit. He says, quote, "We crafted the term the student athlete as soon as it was embedded in the NCAA rules interpretation as a man," and I'll kind of get to the chase. "We had the term student athlete inserted into insurance policy forms as accepted vernacular." Insurance, no, these are student athletes. The concept was benefiting all of college athletics, in quotations. We had stumbled upon the term that served our purposes, and we ran with it. So we have this loophole is created through Briers as a kind of subset of this post-Sanity Code. We're dealing with these new issues, and so they had to create a loophole. Briers would go on to run the NCAA for the next 36 years. So if you think about how this industry really formed and why it took so long for athletes to get paid, you also have the man running the show who who does he report to? Does he report to the Heisman candidates and the All-Americans and the jerseys that we pay for? No. His board, his committee are the institutional members, the universities themselves. And again, even those, Bear Bryant wasn't at any of these meetings. The coaches that were actually generating the buzz, they're not part of this conversation. They're football coaches. So instead, you had university faculty members creating rules to regulate this space. And so with Breyers, there is that conversation. Within the other effect, once Breyers takes into place, is this rise of the administrative state. So Breyers goes out and he models what we saw with kind of this New Deal type relationship, using large institutions to regulate top-down. Breyers created an a regulatory board. He hired people on oversight committees. He started carving out rules, enforcement staff. So he took the lessons from the Sanity Code and said, okay, how do we be more proactive? How do we create this administrative state that we're seeing in the US about how to regulate your space? And it's a top-down kind of admin state. And that really gets cemented in that 1940s transition to the 1950s. So those are the two main things within kind of the NCAA getting its footholding. Player rights or employee rights are starting to pop up. So then how do athletes fall into that conversation? You're also having this rise of the admin state, which then becomes such a pertinent role for how the NCAA carves out this like student athlete conversation when it comes to payment down the road. Again, all setting up the framework for how the NCAA is approaching their athletes, which plays such a critical role into eventually getting to the space that we are now. The one case in this 10-year period that I do want to highlight is a really, really fun one. And it is a lawsuit. It's O'Brien versus Pabst Sales Co. And in effect, what it is Davey O'Brien, who was a Heisman contending quarterback for TCU, helped champion their team, was named to the All-American team. And on that, after being named to the All-American team, PBR came out with an ad campaign. And they had a calendar with all the All-American athletes on their calendar, promoting the upcoming football season. And O'Brien's image was listed on this. So all of a sudden, O'Brien, who was attending Texas Christian University, was a practicing member, did not drink, he saw his mug on a beer campaign. So he files a lawsuit under the right of privacy in Texas, saying that PBR, the company, violated his rights to privacy by putting his image on the poster and calendar. And on initial hearing at the time, the Texas court, it's a fun case, alleges within PBR, they said, one, you're a public figure, so you don't really have a right to privacy. Two, you have previously consented to TCU using your image across the board. And you've been in calendars and promotional periods for TCU. And then three, you're not really harmed. You didn't show any, this is grounding or standing is a really critical legal principle in terms of how cases are applied. What is the actual injury of the person? So within this space, O'Brien tries to appeal. He goes to Texas Appellate Court, so that goes to the Second Division of Texas Courts. Doesn't get to this Texas State Supreme Court or let alone the U.S. Supreme Court. So again, we're talking like a mid-level case here. But the reason why I'm highlighting this is one, to understand how courts were approaching this novel concept. What we now know as N.I.L, name, image, and likeness, was not a legally grounded concept. But it does get highlighted in this case. So on appeal, O'Brien goes back to bat. He kind of doubles down this idea of, well, no, I don't promote drinking. I don't want my face on an image, and he gets struck down again. Ultimately, really the lack of standing in a real injury. O'Brien would go on to the NFL. He had a successful college career. He won a bunch of awards. The court said you weren't really harmed by being on this promotional calendar. I understand on a moral basis, but you didn't have any actual injuries that were resulted from this misuse of your image. So worth noting there, but this right of privacy wasn't discussed. It actually wasn't recognized, but instead we had this brilliant dissent, and I'm going to get Justice Holmes wrote this dissent. So dissent, just for those who don't know, is the disagreeing opinion. Whenever you have any kind of court, United States Supreme Court, you have 9 justices, and look in terms of deciding how the case is ruled, you're going for a 5-4 split is kind of how we often see our cases. And the majority will write their opinion about the legal principles that back up their case, but then you'll have the dissent, the 4 people who can disagree with the legal groundings and principles, and they'll disagree with the argument, and they'll write their opinion in an essay about, no, we actually disagree with the majority's position. The majority still wins, but we're going to get our 2 cents out in terms of an argument about why we think. And often dissents can be a beautiful place to be able to understand legal principles. And this was an excellent example in the 1940s about this. And so Justice Holmes goes on this conversation, and he articulates, from my eyes, one of the first times about this difference between the right of privacy, right? You as a private citizen have, the right to not have your photograph taken without your consent. You have a right of privacy in your home, so, your home is a sacred space, and that there is a commercial good around your image, especially if you're a celebrity. And Holmes expands on this idea. He talks about this principle that, if you are an athlete, it is a distinct thing. There is a commercial property right that is valuable for an athlete like O'Brien. And this belongs to everyone. Everyone has this commercial value around their name, image, and likeness. And for this to get articulated in the 1940s is both novel, but it touches on a series of cases that we're going to really lay out the groundwork for. And what I think is fascinating is that 80 years before we have our current industry, is you have a judge out of Texas who's talking about a distinct right between privacy and your commercial right. You as a person have a commercial property right in yourself. And it really, he feels for O'Brien. He says O'Brien is a famous figure. And if you are a public entity, if anything, that commercial right is that much more valuable. So he talks about, how do you handle that? Well, you're misappropriating someone's image. It's a valued property. This is tort law. This is misuse of your image. And I really like this case as kind of our outro, because it leaves a T. It just drops a little bit of a note about where this case is going to evolve, where this legal space is going to evolve, where we sit now, right? How people, I think at the intro, a salary cap on players. You cannot get paid more than X dollars for your image to go be an athlete and go attend University of Washington. That's my alma mater. I just got to probably get that out there. I'm a Husky, so I'm biased towards the Northwest. But nevertheless, if you choose to attend a university, that is a commercial right, as Justice Holmes is talking about. That is a valuable property. And yet you have, at the congressional level, top down, people trying to regulate how much that right could be worth. And that is a potential interference with your bargaining power, with your ability to generate wealth. It's putting a cap on how much you can without the mechanics of an employment agreement. When I go to work for, a place, or we see it in MLB or any professional league, that's a collective bargaining agreement. That is a binding contract that caps in how much an athlete is worth. If you're Shohei Ohtani, you're worth $50 million. If you're Shea Gilgeous-Alexander, you're worth $60 million at this rate, at this time of your career. Based on how far along your career, we're going to fix your price. Right? But we don't have that mechanic in college sports right now. And so to have this tether of name, image, and likeness is how everyone's being paid right now. It's a valuable property, as Justice Holmes is talking about here. And yet, by trying to price fix it without an employee agreement, without a collective bargaining agreement, is muddying the water. It's creating tension. This is leaving the ripe grounds for potential litigation down the road. And it's so clear, even from 80 years ago, about the gap between how the haves, the people in power, want to regulate this space versus the actual people who are trying to produce, trying to take their teams to national championships. They're trying to get to the professional leagues. People actually putting their bodies, their minds, their spirits on the line week after week aren't at the bargaining table, and their rules are being dictated by some people up top. So I'll leave it there. We're going to dive in more in terms of more substantive cases. Once we kind of roll around to the 60s is when you start to see a lot of litigation. I'll pull up a graph and I'll kind of kick things off for next week. There really wasn't too much lawsuits at this space. It was really kind of, as we talked about, we didn't even get rules until the 1948 with the Sanity Code. So I know it's a little bit more theoretical now, but I was glad to be able to dive into the O'Brien cases, one of the first real cases, and understanding the arguments that are being used. So thank you for your participation, your viewers, and yeah, looking forward to next week. Thanks all.